The train whistle shrieked through the Montana Territory's vast emptiness as Fiona James clutched her worn leather valise, the only dress she owned carefully folded inside along with the 2 letters that contained her most closely guarded secrets. The year was 1878, and at 22, she was venturing farther from Boston than she'd ever imagined possible, all to marry a man whose face she knew only from a small, faded daguerreotype. The train lurched to a stop at Silver Creek Station, a dusty outpost that barely qualified as a town. Fiona smoothed her navy blue traveling dress, the only garment she owned besides the white wedding dress tucked in her valise, and gathered her courage. Her gloved hand trembled as she accepted the conductor's assistance down the iron steps. "Miss James." A tall figure stepped forward from the handful of people waiting on the platform. "I'm Matthew Xavier." Fiona's breath caught. The daguerreotype hadn't done him justice. Matthew stood over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling out a simple white shirt and worn leather vest. His face was tanned from years under the western sun, with laugh lines around eyes the color of the Montana sky. A respectable brown hat shaded his features, and he removed it as he approached, revealing thick chestnut hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Mr. Xavier," she managed, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance." His calloused hand enveloped hers gently. "The pleasure is all mine, Miss James. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." "It was educational," she replied carefully. In truth, it had been harrowing. The money she'd spent on the train ticket had left her with barely anything to her name, and the constant fear of discovery had kept her awake through most of the journey. Matthew's eyes crinkled. "Educational. That's a diplomatic way to put it." He reached for her valise. "Is this all you've brought?" Fiona nodded, fighting the heat of embarrassment in her cheeks. "I travel light, Mr. Xavier." "Matt," he corrected, his voice warm. "We're to be married tomorrow if you're still willing." "Seems like Mr. Xavier is a bit formal." "Then I'm Fiona," she replied, surprised by the warmth his smile kindled. He led her to a wagon hitched to 2 chestnut horses. "Silver Creek's about 5 miles from here. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house is expecting you. I thought you might want a night to settle in before the wedding." Fiona was touched by his consideration. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." As they rode, Matthew pointed out landmarks. The massive mountain range that dominated the western horizon. The creek that gave the town its name. The sprawling ranch lands, including his own modest spread, the Thousand Tomorrows Ranch. "Thousand Tomorrows?" Fiona asked. Matthew's face colored slightly. "My father named it. Said every sunrise out here promises a new beginning. 1,000 tomorrows stretching out before you." He glanced at her. "Sounds foolish when I say it aloud." "Not at all," she said softly. "It sounds like hope." His eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them. Silver Creek proved to be larger than the train station had suggested, a proper town with a main street, several businesses, a church, and a schoolhouse. People nodded respectfully to Matthew as they passed, curiosity evident in their glances toward Fiona. "Word travels fast in a small town," Matthew explained apologetically. "Everyone's been wondering about my mail-order bride." Fiona stiffened. "Is that how they see me? As merchandise ordered through a catalog?" Matthew pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a neat white boarding house. "No," he said firmly. "They see you as the woman brave enough to travel across the country to build a life with a stranger. That commands respect out here." Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a plump, motherly woman who welcomed Fiona warmly. "You must be exhausted, dear. Come along. I've prepared a room and a hot bath for you." Fiona followed gratefully, turning at the door to look at Matthew. "Until tomorrow, then?" He nodded, hat in his hands. "I'll call for you at 11. The preacher's ready whenever we are." He hesitated, Unless you've changed your mind. I haven't, Fiona assured him, though her stomach knotted with anxiety. Would he change his mind if he knew her secrets? That evening, after the most luxurious bath she'd had in months, Fiona sat on the edge of her bed and carefully opened her valise. She removed the simple white dress she'd brought for her wedding, her mother's dress, the only memento she had of the woman who had died when Fiona was just 16. Beneath it lay 2 envelopes, one sealed with wax, the other worn from frequent handling. She opened the worn envelope first, though she knew its contents by heart. The letter inside was from the Boston Police Department, dated 3 months ago, stating that they had evidence connecting her to the theft of valuable jewels from her former employer, Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop. The charge was false. The jewels had been stolen by Mrs. Winthrop's son, Charles, who had tried to force his attentions on Fiona when she refused him. When the jewels went missing, Charles had planted evidence implicating her. With no family to defend her and Charles's word against hers, Fiona had fled Boston. She'd seen Matthew's advertisement in a newspaper seeking a respectable woman of good character willing to travel west and build a life together. She had responded, hoping that in the vastness of Montana, she could escape her past. The second envelope contained a different secret, the deed to a small plot of land in Boston that had been her father's. It wasn't worth much, but it was legally hers, and the only inheritance she had. She'd kept it hidden, afraid that if Charles or the authorities discovered it, they would seize it. Fiona returned both letters to her valise and prepared for bed, her mind racing. Tomorrow she would marry a stranger, a man who seemed kind but who knew nothing of her past or the secrets she carried. The weight of her deception pressed on her heart, but what choice did she have? To tell him would risk losing everything again. Morning came with golden sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. Fiona dressed carefully in her mother's white gown. It was simple but elegant, with tiny pearl buttons down the back that she struggled to fasten herself. A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Henderson, who clucked sympathetically. "Oh, my dear, let me help you with those buttons. A bride shouldn't have to dress herself on her wedding day." As the older woman's nimble fingers worked the buttons, she chatted comfortably. "Matthew Xavier is one of the finest men in these parts. His ranch isn't the biggest, but it's prosperous enough. And unlike some, he built it honest, no taking advantage of others or cutting corners." "How long has he lived here?" Fiona asked, grateful for any information about the man she was about to marry. "Since '69, right after the war. Came west with nothing but determination and his father's pocket watch. His parents died of fever back east." Mrs. Henderson patted the last button into place. "There. You look beautiful, my dear. And don't you worry, Matthew may be a man of few words, but those he speaks, he means." Precisely at 11, Matthew arrived in his wagon, dressed in what was clearly his best outfit: clean dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a black coat that strained slightly across his broad shoulders. He'd tamed his unruly hair and freshly trimmed his beard. His eyes widened when he saw Fiona in her white dress. "You look," he seemed to search for words, "like a vision from a better world than this one." Fiona felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you. You're very handsome yourself." The ceremony at Silver Creek's small white church was brief and attended by a handful of Matthew's friends. The preacher, Reverend Johnson, spoke of commitment and new beginnings, and when it came time to exchange vows, Matthew's strong voice didn't waver. "I, Matthew James Xavier, take thee, Fiona Margaret James, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to protect you, provide for you, and give you 1,000 tomorrows filled with all the happiness I can muster." His improvisation on the traditional vows brought tears to Fiona's eyes. When her turn came, her voice trembled but held firm. "I, Fiona Margaret James, take thee, Matthew James Xavier, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand by you, to make a home with you, and to face each tomorrow by your side, come what may. The small gathering cheered when Reverend Johnson pronounced them man and wife, and Matthew leaned down to place a gentle, almost hesitant kiss on her lips there first. It was brief but left Fiona with a fluttering sensation in her chest. A modest celebration followed at the town's only restaurant, where Matthew's friends welcomed Fiona warmly. Sheriff Tom Miller, a gruff but kind man, teased Matthew mercilessly about finally finding a woman brave enough to take him on. Doc Peterson and his wife Sarah presented them with a hand-stitched quilt. And Abigail Wright, the town schoolteacher, pressed a book of poetry into Fiona's hands. "For the quiet evenings," she whispered with a knowing smile. By late afternoon, they were heading toward the Thousand Tomorrows Ranch. Fiona sat beside Matthew on the wagon seat, her valise at her feet, acutely aware that she was traveling to her new home with all her worldly possessions contained in one small case. "It's not much," Matthew said as they approached a modest but well-built cabin nestled against a stand of pines, with mountains rising majestically behind it. A barn and corral stood nearby, housing several horses and a small herd of cattle grazing in the distance. "But it's solid, and there's room to grow." "It's beautiful," Fiona said honestly. After months of uncertainty and fear, the sight of the sturdy cabin with smoke curling from its chimney filled her with unexpected longing. Could this really be home? Matthew helped her down from the wagon and, to her surprise, swept her into his arms before carrying her across the threshold. "For luck," he explained with a shy smile, setting her gently on her feet inside. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, wooden table and chairs, and a small sofa. A kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. And through a doorway, a bedroom with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt. Fiona stood awkwardly, suddenly very aware that they were alone and married. Matthew seemed to sense her nervousness. "I know this is all sudden," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "We're strangers still, despite what the law and church now say. I want you to know that I don't. That is, I won't expect." He took a deep breath. "What I mean to say is, I'll sleep in the barn until you're comfortable with other arrangements." Relief and an unexpected twinge of disappointment mingled in Fiona's chest. "That's very considerate, but you needn't banish yourself from your own home." "Our home now," he corrected gently. "And it's no hardship. I've spent many nights in that barn." He smiled. "Though I admit the bed is more comfortable." That evening they prepared supper together, Matthew showing Fiona where everything was kept. He was a surprisingly competent cook, explaining that he'd been fending for himself for years. "Tomorrow I'll show you the ranch," he said as they sat at the table, sharing a meal of venison stew and fresh bread. "It's 50 acres, mostly grazing land. I run about 60 head of cattle and breed quarter horses. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to live on comfortably." "It sounds wonderful," Fiona said, meaning it. "I confess I don't know much about ranching, but I'm eager to learn." "You'll have time." His eyes met hers across the table. 1,000 tomorrows, remember? That night, despite his protests, Fiona insisted that Matthew take the bed while she slept on the sofa. She lay awake long after he had retired to the bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Montana night, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the pines, the occasional soft nickering of horses from the barn. She thought of the letters hidden in her valise, now tucked under the sofa. How long could she keep her secrets? Would Matthew understand if he knew the truth, or would he see her as Boston had a thief, a woman of questionable character? The next morning, Matthew was already up when Fiona awoke, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the cabin. He'd laid out a simple breakfast and was pulling on his boots by the door. "Morning chores," he explained. Thought I'd let you sleep. There's hot water on the stove if you want to wash up. Fiona nodded gratefully, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance and morning breath. I'll just be a moment. By the time she had freshened up and changed into her navy traveling dress, the only other clothing she owned, Matthew had returned. His eyebrows rose slightly. Same dress as yesterday? Fiona felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. I only brought two. This one and my wedding dress. Matthew frowned. 2 dresses? That's all. I told you I traveled light, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. I didn't have much to begin with, and the train ticket was expensive. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that might have been anger, though not directed at her. I see. Well, we'll need to remedy that. There's a dry goods store in town that carries fabric. We can ride in tomorrow and get whatever you need. That's very kind, but I don't want to be a burden. You're my wife, he interrupted firmly. Not a burden. And a woman needs more than 2 dresses. After breakfast, Matthew gave her a tour of the ranch. He showed her the barn with its 6 stalls, currently housing 4 horses, his own mount, a powerful black gelding named Thunder, 2 working horses, Bess and Jake, and a gentle mare named Daisy. Thought Daisy might suit you, he said, as the pretty chestnut nuzzled Fiona's hand. She's sweet-tempered but spirited enough to be interesting. She's beautiful. Fiona stroked the mare's velvet nose. But I should tell you, I've never ridden a horse before. Matthew looked surprised, then laughed. Well, we'll have to change that. Can't have a rancher's wife who can't ride. Next, he showed her the cattle grazing on the rolling pastureland, the small vegetable garden he maintained near the cabin, and the creek that provided fresh water year-round. Everywhere she looked, Fiona saw evidence of hard work and careful stewardship. You've built something wonderful here, she told him as they walked back toward the cabin. I've made a start, he corrected. But there's more I want to do. Expand the herd. Maybe build a larger house someday. He glanced at her. If you think you could be happy here. I think I could, she said softly, and was surprised to realize she meant it. The days began to settle into a routine. Matthew worked from sunrise to sunset, caring for the animals and the land. Fiona took over the household duties, cooking and cleaning, and gradually adding her touch to the cabin's sparse interior. True to his word, Matthew took her to town and insisted she select fabric for several new dresses, along with other necessities. Choose whatever you like, he encouraged. Don't worry about the cost. By the end of their first week together, Fiona had 3 new dresses in the making and was starting to feel less like an interloper and more like she belonged. Matthew continued to sleep in the barn, despite her protests about the cooling autumn nights. When you're ready, was all he would say, his eyes warm but respectful. On their 10th day as husband and wife, disaster struck. Fiona was alone at the cabin, Matthew having ridden to a neighboring ranch to help with a difficult calving, when a smart buggy pulled up outside. A well-dressed man with a city suit and bowler hat stepped down, followed by another man wearing a silver star on his vest. Mrs. Xavier? The first man called out. I'm looking for Fiona James or Fiona Xavier now. I understand. Fiona's blood turned to ice. She recognized that voice, though she'd hoped never to hear it again. Charles Winthrop had found her. With trembling hands, she opened the cabin door. Mr. Winthrop, this is unexpected. Charles smiled, the same cold, calculating smile she remembered from Boston. Did you really think you could disappear so easily, Fiona? A thief who stole from my mother's very bedroom. The man with the star, clearly some sort of lawman, stepped forward. Madam, I'm Marshal Robert Davis. I have a warrant for your arrest from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on charges of grand theft. Fiona gripped the doorframe for support. I didn't steal anything. You know that, Charles. The evidence says otherwise, Charles replied smoothly. The brooch was found among your things, and you fled rather than face justice. Quite damning, wouldn't you say, Marshal? Marshal Davis looked uncomfortable but nodded. I'll need you to come with us, Mrs. Xavier. We have a train to catch tomorrow morning. I'm not going anywhere, Fiona said, her voice stronger than she felt. This is my home now. My husband will be back soon, and your husband, Charles interrupted, will surely want nothing to do with you once he learns he's married a thief. Imagine the scandal, the shame. The marshal looked between them. Mrs. Xavier, I suggest you pack your things and come quietly. It will be easier for everyone. I won't, Fiona insisted, though fear clawed at her throat. I'm innocent, and I won't be dragged back to Boston to face false charges. Charles's face hardened. Marshal, I believe you have the authority to remove her by force if necessary. Before the marshal could respond, the sound of galloping hooves announced Matthew's arrival. He dismounted in a cloud of dust, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him. What's going on here? He demanded, moving to stand beside Fiona. Marshal Davis introduced himself and explained the situation. Charles added his own embellishments, painting Fiona as a conniving thief who had preyed on his mother's good nature before stealing valuable family heirlooms. Matthew listened without expression, his jaw tight. When they finished, he turned to Fiona. Is this true? She met his eyes, her heart pounding. I didn't steal anything. Charles tried to force himself on me. When I refused and threatened to tell his mother, the brooch went missing. He planted it among my things and accused me of theft. She took a deep breath. I ran because no one would believe a housemaid over the son of one of Boston's wealthiest families. Preposterous, Charles exclaimed. Marshal, I won't stand here and be slandered by this criminal. Matthew's eyes never left Fiona's face. Why didn't you tell me? I was afraid, she whispered. Afraid you wouldn't want a wife with a cloud of suspicion hanging over her. Afraid you'd send me away. Something shifted in Matthew's expression. He turned to the marshal. My wife isn't going anywhere with you, Marshal Davis. Not today, not tomorrow. I have a legal warrant. Based on the word of this man? Matthew nodded toward Charles. I know my wife's character better than either of you. If she says she's innocent, then she is. Charles scoffed. You've been married, a week? What could you possibly know about her character? Enough, Matthew said firmly. And I know something about character in general, which is more than I can say for a man who would travel 2,000 miles to persecute a woman who rejected him. The marshal shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Xavier, I sympathize with your position, but the law is the law. I have to take her in. Then you'll have to take me too, Matthew stated. And I promise you, Marshal, I won't go quietly. Furthermore, Sheriff Miller is a personal friend, and I guarantee he'll have questions about an Eastern Marshal operating in his jurisdiction without courtesy notification. Marshal Davis hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Perhaps there's room for discussion here. There's nothing to discuss, Charles snapped. She's a thief and she's coming back to Boston to face justice. No, she isn't, came a new voice. Sheriff Tom Miller rode up, his deputy beside him. Marshal Davis, I'm surprised to find you in my territory without so much as a howdy-do. The marshal had the grace to look embarrassed. Sheriff Miller, I apologize for the oversight. I'm here on official business from Massachusetts. So I gather, Miller dismounted, nodding to Matthew. And yet you didn't think to check in with me first? Seems odd, given professional courtesy. While the lawman spoke, Fiona slipped into the cabin and retrieved the sealed envelope from her valise. Her hands shook as she broke the wax seal for the first time. She returned to Matthew's side and handed him the document inside. "This is the second secret I kept from you," she said quietly. "It's the deed to a small property in Boston, left to me by my father. It's not worth much, but it's legally mine." Matthew scanned the document, then handed it to Sheriff Miller. "Seems to me, Sheriff, that a woman with property of her own wouldn't need to steal brooches." Miller examined the deed and nodded slowly. "Interesting timing, too." According to the date on this arrest warrant, the alleged theft occurred just 2 weeks after Miss James here came into her inheritance. He looked at Charles Winthrop appraisingly. "Makes a man wonder if someone might have had reason to want her discredited and out of the way." Charles's face flushed. "This is absurd. That property is worthless, a run-down building in a poor part of town." "Maybe to you," Miller agreed. "But I've heard that part of Boston is being developed now. Industrial interests buying up land for factories and such. Land that might be worth quite a bit more than it was a year ago." Marshal Davis frowned, looking between Charles and the deed. "Mr. Winthrop didn't mention any of this to me." "I imagine there's a lot Mr. Winthrop didn't mention," Matthew said coldly. "Like his real interest in my wife." Charles adjusted his collar nervously. "This is all conjecture and distraction. The fact remains that Mrs. Xavier or James, or whatever she calls herself now, is wanted for theft in Massachusetts." "Actually," Sheriff Miller said thoughtfully, "what I'm seeing is a lot of questions about the validity of these charges, and a lot of reasons why pursuing them might not be in anyone's best interest." He fixed Charles with a hard stare. "Especially if certain other allegations were to be investigated more thoroughly." The standoff continued for several tense minutes before Marshal Davis finally sighed. "I think, Mr. Winthrop, that there may be some discrepancies in the information you provided me. Perhaps it would be best if we revisited this matter after further investigation." Charles sputtered in protest, but it was clear the marshal's resolve had wavered. Sheriff Miller escorted them both back to town, promising Matthew and Fiona that he would make sure they found their way east without further disturbance. When they were gone, Fiona collapsed against Matthew's chest, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you everything from the beginning." Matthew's arms tightened around her. "Yes, you should have, but I understand why you didn't." He tilted her chin up, his blue eyes searching hers. "No more secrets between us, Fiona. Not ever again." "No more secrets," she agreed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was so afraid you wouldn't want me if you knew." "Want you?" Matthew shook his head in disbelief. "Fiona Xavier, I've wanted you since the moment you stepped off that train in your blue dress," looking both terrified and determined. "Nothing could change that." He lowered his mouth to hers, and this time there was nothing hesitant about his kiss. It was deep and certain, a promise more binding than their wedding vows had been. That night, for the first time, they shared the bed in the cabin's small bedroom. Fiona, in a new nightgown she'd sewn from soft cotton, trembled as Matthew's calloused hands gently explored her body. "Are you sure?" he whispered against her throat. "We don't have to." "I'm sure," she said, pulling him closer. "I want to truly be your wife in every way." Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight filtered through the window, Fiona felt a peace she hadn't known in years. "Do you really think Sheriff Miller can keep Charles from causing more trouble?" Matthew stroked her hair. "Tom Miller isn't just a sheriff. He's a former Pinkerton detective with connections all over the country. By the time he's done, I suspect Mr. Charles Winthrop will be very eager to forget he ever knew you." 2 weeks later, a telegram arrived from Boston confirming just that. Charles Winthrop had withdrawn all charges, and furthermore, had made a generous offer to purchase Fiona's property through intermediaries, of course. Sheriff Miller advised accepting the offer. "It's blood money," Fiona said, staring at the telegram. "It's justice," Matthew countered. "And a chance to build our future without looking over our shoulders." They accepted the offer. The money allowed them to expand the ranch, adding 100 acres and doubling their cattle herd. Matthew hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload, and by spring they had broken ground on a new, larger house near the old cabin. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Matthew placed his hand over Fiona's still flat belly. "Do you think our child will love this land as much as we do?" Fiona covered his hand with hers, smiling. "How did you know? I was going to tell you tonight." "A husband notices things," he said, pulling her close, "like when his wife can't keep down breakfast 3 days running." She laughed, leaning into his embrace. "I hope our baby loves it here. I hope they understand what it means to have 1,000 tomorrows stretching out before them." "They will," Matthew promised, kissing her softly, "because we'll show them every day." As twilight deepened into night, Fiona marveled at the journey that had brought her here. One dress, 2 secrets, and a desperate hope had led her to a man who had given her exactly what he'd promised 1,000 tomorrows, each one filled with more happiness than she'd ever dreamed possible. And as the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. Not as a mail-order bride or a woman with secrets, but as Fiona Xavier, beloved wife, expectant mother, and mistress of the 1,000 Tomorrows ranch home at last.